these scriptures on Brotherhood. So these are scriptures for the Brotherhood of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel, those who are of Negro, Hispanic, and Native American descent. These are all the scriptures about Brotherhood. We read 1 John, 4th chapter, 18th verse to the 21st verse. 1 John, 3rd chapter, 11th verse to the 18th verse. 2 John, verse 6. Leviticus, chapter 19, 17th verse to the 18th verse. 1 Peter, chapter 4, 7th verse to the 10th verse. St. John, chapter 13, 3rd verse to the 17th verse. St. John, chapter 13, 34th verse to the 35th verse. St. John, chapter 15, 12th verse to the 17th verse. Mark, chapter 12, 29th verse to the 33rd verse. James, chapter 2, 8th verse. Matthew, chapter 25, 34th verse to the end. Galatians, 5th chapter, 14th verse to the end. Ephesians, 5th chapter, 1st verse to the 5th verse. Psalms, the entire 133rd chapter. 2 Samuel, 1st chapter, 26th verse. Romans, 12th chapter, 9th verse to the end. 1 Corinthians, 1st chapter, 10th verse. Philippians, 2nd chapter, 1st verse to the 9th verse. Philippians, 1st chapter, 27th verse. 1 Peter, 3rd chapter, 8th verse to the 13th verse. Proverbs, 6th chapter, 16th verse to the 19th verse. Colossians, 3rd chapter, 8th verse to the 15th verse. 1 Peter, 1st chapter to the 22nd verse to the end. Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 1 to 5. 1 John, 2nd chapter, 9 to 11. 2 Peter, 1st chapter, verse 4 to 12. 1 Corinthians, 13th chapter, verse 1 to 6. Revelations, 19th chapter, verse 10. Matthew, 18th chapter, verse 15 to 22. Luke, 17th chapter, verse 3 to 5. Galatians, 6th chapter, verse 1 to 3. Galatians, 6th chapter, verse 9 to 10. Matthew, 18th chapter, 23rd verse to the end. Ecclesiastes, 7th chapter, 9th verse. Proverbs, 14th chapter, 29th verse. Proverbs, 15th chapter, 1st verse. Ecclesiasticus in the Apocrypha, 6th chapter, 5th verse to the 18th verse. 1 Corinthians, 4th chapter, 20th verse. 1 Peter, 2nd chapter, 1st verse. St. John, 1st chapter, 47th verse. 1 Thessalonians, 5th chapter, 9th verse to the end. 1 Timothy, 5th chapter, the 17th verse. Hebrews, 13th chapter, 1st verse to the 2nd verse. Hebrews, 13th chapter, 5th verse to the 7th verse. Hebrews, 13th chapter, 16th verse to the 17th verse. Ecclesiasticus in the Bible, 28th chapter, 1st verse to the 18th verse. Matthew's, 5th chapter, 22nd verse to the 25th verse. Romans, 14th chapter, 13th verse. Zechariah, 7th chapter, 9th verse to the end. Zechariah, 8th chapter, 16th verse and the 17th verse. Ecclesiasticus in the Bible, 14th chapter, 13th verse. Ecclesiasticus in the Apocrypha, sorry about that. 7th chapter, 10th verse to the 13th verse. Ecclesiasticus in the Apocrypha, 7th chapter, 15th to the 16th verse. Ecclesiasticus in the Apocrypha, 9th chapter, 15th verse to the 16th verse. Ecclesiasticus in the Apocrypha, 4th chapter, 7th verse. Ecclesiasticus in the Apocrypha, 29th chapter, 10th verse. Proverbs, 17th chapter, 17th verse. Proverbs, 18th chapter, 21st verse. Hebrews, 10th chapter, 22nd verse to the 25th verse. Romans, 8th chapter, 19th verse. Romans, 8th chapter, 28th verse to the 30th verse. 1 Thessalonians, 3rd chapter, 11th verse to the 13th verse. 2 Corinthians, 13th chapter to the 11th verse. And Romans, 15th chapter, 4th verse. All of those scriptures are about the Brotherhood for the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. Shalom.